welcome Russ Daibo to the conversation. We've been having conversations about pertinent issues that evolve around the nation and what's going on around across Canada. I'll just turn the mic over to him. Welcome, Russ. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm not sure what you've discussed and what you want me to cover. Maybe you could mention that to me.
Yeah. So this whole meeting has been about the First Nation Land Management Act, how it affects us. I went through a slideshow presentation, and it just basically goes through. Excuse me. It just basically goes through some of the terminology and the negative effects, the positive effects, if there are any, to the nation, and just some of the legal ramifications of it. And currently, we were discussing before you joined of how we can get this information to the members, because a lot of this isn't being talked about. And I will share that Zoom. The whole Zoom meeting with you. I'll send you the recording once we compile it and put it together. Right now, the only ones you can see it are the ones that are in this Zoom meeting currently, which is 6 of us. So
sure,
I'll send you a copy of that, and then you'll see that I'm kind of new to this whole presentation thing, but I just felt that was the quickest way to go about it.
All right. Well. All right. All right, I'll jump in then. So I'm a member of the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake. My background is I've been a policy analyst for a few decades. I've worked for different bands, and I still do advise certain band councils. I worked for the Assembly of First Nations when Ovid McCurdy was national chief. I was the Indian Act Amendments coordinator in 1996-97. I've worked for regional organizations. Out in British Columbia, I was executive liaison for the Interior Alliance and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. When Arthur Manuel, who was a good friend of mine when he was a chief and a leader out there. So I've had quite a few years of experience. At one point, I was involved with the Liberal Party from 1990 to 94. I helped create the Aboriginal Liberal Commission, and I was vice president of policy for the Aboriginal Liberal Commission during those years from 1990 to 94. So I was involved in the 1993 Red Book, developing the Aboriginal platform. And I left the party when Jean Chrétien became prime minister and broke the promises in the Red Book, including the recognition of the inherent right to self-government as an existing right under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. In 1995, they came up with an inherent right policy, they called it. That's an anything but an inherent right policy. And a number of us who were the founding executives of the Aboriginal Liberal Commission left the party in 1996, did a joint press conference with Ovid McCurdy denouncing Chrétien's betrayal to us and imposing that self-government policy, which has led to some agreements and is the basis of, basically it's the umbrella policy of the federal government, and all discussions and negotiations are based on the principles of that policy, including all legislation like the Indigenous languages legislation and the Indigenous Child and Family Services legislation. But getting back to the First Nations Land Management Act, it was originally proposed by 13 bands when Jean Chrétien was prime minister. It was passed into law under a majority Liberal government in 1999. And in 2004, Jean Chrétien's government added to that Land Management Act by passing the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. And so between those two laws, it's to basically assimilate Indian bands into Canada's property and tax system. And hundreds of bands have entered into the Land Management Act to develop land codes. And many of the ones that have gone into developing land codes have also gone into the fiscal Management Act to develop real property taxes on reserve. And ultimately, it's to lead to self-government agreements. I sent a chart to Kevin showing a federal chart showing that there's different stages to getting to self-government. One stage is the existing Indian Act, managing lands under the Indian Act, where you have to get permission from Ottawa, to pass bylaws or to manage. Then there's the enhanced powers under the Indian Act. And then there's the First Nations Land Management Act. And beyond that, they have what's called other tenure, which is the next step after developing a land code is Canada's been working on the First Nations Property Ownership Initiative, led by the First Nations Tax Commission, Manny Jules. Under Harper, that's what it was called, the First Nations Property Ownership Initiative, which is to privatize residential lands on reserve into fee simple, like non-native people hold property in the city of, Saskatoon or anywhere. And the Liberal government has continued with that, but they call it the Indigenous Land Title Initiative. But it's still about privatizing residential lands on reserve. And then the final stage is self-government. And there was an exchange with Prime Minister Trudeau and a proxy from the Tsuut'ina Band at the last meeting in December, where she asked Prime Minister, trying to think of her name right now, can't think of it. She was the proxy for Tsuut'ina anyway. She asked the Prime Minister, she said, the Minister of Justice, he had appeared during the assembly too, and said that when they deconstruct colonialism, then they'll move into self-government. And she said, well, that's the Indian Act. So she asked the Prime Minister, are you asking us to forget about treaties and go into become municipalities? And the Prime Minister didn't answer her question directly. He referred to his self-government policy and said that all First Nations are on the journey to achieving full self-government status. And he said some have achieved it, which is true. There's dozens of bands that have signed self-government agreements, or what they call modern treaties. And as the Prime Minister pointed out, there are other bands who are working on it, because there's hundreds of bands at negotiating tables right now. So originally, that First Nations Land Management Act from 1999 was supposed to be optional for the 13 bands. But anytime the government of Canada says something's optional, they work to make it the only option. And so since then, in order to get out of the red tape of Indian affairs and that, they're saying you have to go into that Land Management Act, develop your own land code. But what that does is it removes you from 40 sections of the Indian Act, and it does make it easier to make decisions locally. But you also don't have, you're basically ending the ongoing treaty and fiduciary obligations of the federal government. So if you take over managing your lands through a land code, and let's say you found a whole bunch of PCB barrels had been dumped under a place where you want to build a school, well, the federal government's no longer responsible for that. You are, because you've taken over. The obligations of the federal government have ended, so you have to pay for all that. And they've set up a national institution called the Lands Advisory Board that's advising bands, who want to go into the First Nations Land Management Act. It's headed up by a lawyer named Rob Louie, who's based in West Bank, BC. That's where the office is. Or actually, they have it in North Bay, Ontario, I think, the head office. But he doesn't have any experience with historic treaties. And most of the reserves on the prairies were set up, well, I think all the reserves pretty much were set up under treaty. So once you start changing the status of the reserves that were set aside under treaty, you're altering the treaty relationship too. And that was one of the goals of the federal government, was to get out of the ongoing, treaty obligations. So it's my submission. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a policy analyst, but the way I see it is the federal government's been looking for ways to offload their responsibilities, and the Land Management Act is one way to do it. The other thing I'd say about the Land Management Act is the people don't get a say in it. The bands get into the Land Management Act through a band council resolution. And the only time band members have a say is after the band council gets, I don't know, about 100,000 or so to develop a draft land code. Then the band members get to vote on the draft land code, whether to accept it or not. And in doing that, I've seen where certain bands have held meetings and or referendums, and not many people come out. So what the federal government does in that case, instead of requiring 50% plus one of the membership to vote on a land code, they drop it down to 25% of the membership. So it's the majority of 25% that come out to vote on the land code. If it passes the majority of a 25% threshold vote, then the federal government accepts that as valid. And, at that point, it then becomes, they then move the band out of the Indian Act into that First Nations Land Management Act, and that new land code applies. So there's a lot of issues with it that benefit the government of Canada, not so much First Nations peoples, in my opinion. But like I said, ultimately, it's about reaching self-government agreements. And the self-government policy is the policy they use to negotiate implementation of historic treaties. And right now, Canada's also set up recognition and self-determination tables. You could look on, you can Google that on and look at Canada's website for recognition tables. And you'll see that there's some in Saskatchewan, there's some in Alberta, Manitoba, basically Ontario, across the country. They have these recognition tables, and that's what the tables are supposed to do, is lead towards agreements. Now, they're non-binding discussions at those tables. The whole purpose of those recognition tables is to develop a joint negotiation mandate. But the federal representatives on those tables basically have a veto, because in order to get a joint negotiation mandate, you have to have a cabinet submission, and cabinet has to approve the mandate. And the federal negotiators aren't forwarding, proposals at these tables unless they fit within their self-government policy. So a lot of these discussion tables are being bottlenecked. That's what I'm hearing from different band councils, that the government's not moving ahead. And it's because the government said at the beginning, you could talk about anything you want, at these tables about, self-government, self-determination, taking over programs, whatever. But if it doesn't fit within their policy, they're not going to take it up to get a mandate to move to actually binding negotiations. And so that's what's been happening across the country too. And so this has been going on for the last 6 years, right? Trudeau has got in 2015. In 2016, he started to implement his reconciliation plan, which is made up of all these policy and legislative measures. But they've also been continuing what's been passed before he formed the government, including this legislation, the Land Management Act. So that's what I know about the Land Management Act. It's very tricky business. I guess the last thing I'd say is I work with one band in BC who a previous chief and council started to get them into the Land Management Act. The current chief and council said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to develop our own alternative. And so they stopped the process. They didn't develop a draft land code. I don't believe they took the money to develop the draft land code. So although they're listed on the list, there's a schedule. If you go look at the First Nations Land Management Act, they have Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 attached to it. It's all online. They're listed as one of the bands in BC. In the developmental side, but they never moved past the developmental side to actually developing a land code. So that's one example I know where they didn't proceed. I know another example in Ontario of a ban where a lot of the community members oppose it, but it's proceeding, the band council is proceeding to develop a land code to be voted on by the membership. So although they're opposing the First Nations Land Management Act, and they have what's called an unceded reserve. The reserve was set, there's different instruments that have created reserves across Canada. And the way they set up the one over there in Ontario, it didn't require any surrender or anything. So they have land. It wasn't done through like a treaty. So they're worried about how that going into the Land Management Act is going to affect their legal status, around their title. And it only deals with on-reserve lands, the First Nations Land Management Act. It doesn't deal with off-reserve interests. That's something you should be aware of. And it's to develop a land code on reserve to register individual interests. But like I say, if you look at the government's plans, it's only one step. There's further steps to reach self-government and this private ownership or fee simple approach. So that's, and you can develop alternatives to it. I've seen one band in Ontario developed a First Nations land law after 2 years of consultation with members, but it's outside of the First Nations Land Management Act. So there are options that could be looked at, but it requires basically research, mapping, and planning. It requires having a real local self-determination approach driven by the membership, not the leadership, not the band council, but the people. And it takes an effort to do that. It takes organization, but I'm seeing it being done anyway. So I don't know, Kevin, is that what you wanted me to cover?
Yes, thank you very much, Russ. And that was kind of leads into what we were talking about before you joined, was how do we go about, educating the people on this, and how do we go about into initiating something else that works for us? Those true self-determinations, those true self-governments that hold true to our beliefs and not the governments. So that's how we're trying to organize, and that's what we're trying to do.
So I think, on this First Nations land management issue, that's the first thing you got to do is create materials which are very easily understood. Showing the people where this leads. I think that you have to show them that the development of the land code is part of a longer plan that the federal government has in place to go to self-government, because that is what's happening. The Trudeau government dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs, and they created these two new Indigenous departments because they're taking a pan-Indigenous approach, lumping First Nations in with Métis and Inuit. And the reason why they have two departments and two ministers is because, the Minister of Indigenous Services is for the on-reserve programs. Her job is to get the capacity up within the bands, the band council and band administrations, to sign self-government agreements, and then the bands are going to be moved over to Crown Indigenous Services to implement the agreement. And then they're going to dissolve Indigenous Services Canada once they get everybody into that. That's why they've come up with the 10-year funding agreement, right? It's to put the bands onto preparing, some, they might have to renew the 10-year agreement for another 10 years if their negotiations aren't as far along. But the government wants to get all bands, no exceptions, into the self-government agreements, whether you're from a Treaty 6 or from BC, where you don't have a treaty. That's the plan. That's the National Reconciliation Plan. And I think, the First Nations Land Management Act is a good starting off point to point out, this is about municipalization, really. A friend of mine, Dr. Jeremy Schmidt, just put out a paper called dispossession by municipalization. And that's what he's documenting, is how Trudeau's reconciliation plan is based on, turning Indian bands into municipalities. And he documents that, right? He's a PhD, he's teaching in England. But he went to grad school with Justin Trudeau, so he knows him personally. He was in classes with him and argued with him, he was telling me that. So he put that paper out, it's very academic. It's not something you can explain to many community people, but it reinforces, the fact that there is a larger national plan the federal government's implementing, which is going to affect all the bands. He also did another paper on this privatization of reserves, where he documents this First Nations property ownership initiative that the federal government and Manny Joes are working on to turn reserves into private property. And he got freedom of information from the federal government. That's where I got that chart I sent to Kevin, showing the different stages leading to self-government, they call it the options for land status, for bands, right? They say it's options, right? But really it's part of the plan to drive them to the destination, which is self-government. So the First Nations Land Management Act, I think first thing they have to understand is it's not intended to be permanent and final. It's a step along the way. Because even the 1969 white paper said there's going to be several steps from moving the existing reserves into fee simple. And really, this is implementing a lot of what the white paper proposed in 1969 to get rid of reserves, right? To get rid of treaties, to get rid of Indians. And so there is a larger plan underway, and the First Nations Land Management Act is one instrument to do it. But, when you have reserves that were set aside by treaty, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going to happen to the treaty relationship if you start agreeing to, this is a federal law. So you have the Indian Act, you're opting out of the Indian Act, but you're opting into another federal law that allows you to develop a land code. But once you start messing with the legal status, I think you really need legal advice about what does it mean if your reserve was set aside by treaty, which was supposed to be in perpetuity, right? So I think for treaty nations on the prairies in particular, you have some serious questions to ask about the legality of opting into this, because there are serious legal questions about the federal government's obligation. And I think you have to keep in mind that the reserve system was set up so that non-natives could benefit from the surrounding lands. And, even in the history, the Indian Act's been the main law they've used to control and manage us. And it's still, they dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs, but they're keeping the Indian Act in place to control and manage us under a new fiscal relationship until they can move us into these self-government agreements. And it was in 1927, they amended the Indian Act to make it illegal for Indians to hire lawyers, to hold ceremonies or meetings. And that's when a lot of the traditional people had to go underground, right, to hold ceremonies, because the Indian agents were on each reserve and they had to hide from them because the RCMP would come in and arrest people. And so even meetings and all that were held. And that's when, they stole wampum belts and masks, and a lot of the material culture connected to our ceremonies, which is connected to our governance, was from 1927 to 1951 is when they amended the Indian Act again to get rid of those restrictions. But it was in 1931 that they passed the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, transferring the lands to the provinces, while Indians were not allowed to hire lawyers or to meet and organize to fight that. So that's how, on the prairies, the provinces are saying they're not going to do any revenue sharing off reserve because they're using the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. You see what I mean? There's been systematic denial and forced underdevelopment, creating poverty and dependency on federal transfers. And that's what, the federal government's taken advantage of is the poverty and the dependency. And and that's why a lot of bands are going into the First Nations Land Management Act, is to get out of the red tape, as they say, and to be able to make their own decisions over lands locally. That's what a lot of band councils are saying that are buying into this. But, you know, there's a lot of strings attached to going down this road. And that's what the people have to understand, how it's going to impact them personally and their children's future, their grandchildren. Because it's also tied to Indian status, right? They're controlling status. If you marry out, you know, at some point you're not going to be eligible to live on the existing reserve, right? You can't, you know, in the estates, you can't pass your land on to grandkids or whatever if they're not married in. So this is all tied together in a bundle. You can't look at the Land Management Act in isolation from governance and in the future, because the government has a national plan that they're implementing. What kind of plan do we have, you know, to develop our own path out of the Indian Act that's not controlled by Ottawa? And I think that's what community people have to start talking about. You know, the families really need to start talking about, where are we going under this relationship with the federal government? Because they're the ones that are driving everything, not us. And they're using the money. They're using our dependency on programs and service dollars, you know, which they design. And that's why there's two departments. You got to point that out to the people. There's a reason why they dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs. And now they're talking about Indigenous governing bodies. That's the definition they're using to transition us, because we're in transition now, band by band. That's how they're negotiating this, band by band. So Indigenous governing bodies are defined as band councils, Indigenous governments, and entities with a Section 35 mandate. For example, Child and Family Service Agency would have a mandate with Section 35, but it's all defined through these policies, federal policies. So when they say they recognize the inherent right, it's as defined by the federal government. It's not what we need. But they're very slick with their words. You have to remember they have policy definitions to the words they use. So Indigenous governing body, when it says an Indigenous government, that means you've either signed a self-government agreement to be a recognized Indigenous government, or in areas where there's no land treaties, you've signed a modern treaty, as they call it, a comprehensive claims settlement agreement, like in British Columbia, you know, or in the Atlantic region, where they only have peace and friendship treaties. Ganawage, we only have peace and friendship treaties from the 1760 to 1764. We don't have land treaties. And our treaties are with the British, not Canada. It was before Canada was even created, you know, as Haudenosaunee. So that's what Canada wants to change into a new relationship, as they call it. And, you know, basically what they're doing is finishing what the Indian Act started, right? Because the Indian Act was to assimilate us, to become enfranchised, to become Canadians, right? And although they got rid of that in 1985, they don't call it enfranchisement. They're still doing it through the agreements that they're getting, band by band, that they're getting them to negotiate. And also, these are all in secret, right? Like, all the talks between the band councils and the federal government are secret, and the members don't know what's going on until the band council comes and says, okay, we have an agreement we want you to vote on. You know, it's whether it's the land management, land code, whether it's a new tax system on reserve, whether it's a self-government agreement or treaty land entitlement, you know. Treaty land entitlement is specific claims, and they only give money, not land. And then when you get the money, you have to buy the land on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. And, you know, you have to, there's a certainty clause, a finality clause in those treaty land entitlement agreements where you can't raise the matter again. So there's like these one-off agreements which end that part of the treaty relationship, right? Once you settle that issue, and then there's what they call the cows and plows, the agricultural instruments. The government wants to just pay those out and say it's done. But when that was negotiated under treaty, there was supposed to be an ongoing treaty relationship in, you know, a permanent one. So somehow you need to create, I don't know, videos, you know, materials, talk to other bands, where the people were fighting this from happening too, because, If you go and look at the First Nations Land Management Act, attached to that act is Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. And in those schedules, it lists all the bands that have signed on to the developmental part. I think that's Schedule 1, where they sign saying they intend to go into the Land Management Act. And Schedule 2 is the bands that have developed land codes and they're implementing. The land codes have been approved by referendums and they're implementing them. So that's what you need to do is, I think, talk to other bands, especially on there's a few in Saskatchewan. You can look and see who's listed on there. Peter Ballantyne isn't listed on there, so you must be on the developmental side. Because I looked last night when Kevin asked me about this. So that means you haven't signed on yet, but your band is thinking about it. Your band council is thinking about it, I guess. But they haven't taken the steps yet. At least they're not on the list. And that's the other thing you need to find out is what's the status of this? Because the people aren't even going to have a say until the land code is drafted and put to a vote. And by then you got the band council's taken $100,000, so the train is pretty much on the tracks and moving by the time the people get a vote. You know, the band council's made the decision for everybody, and they don't have to ask everybody what they think, right? They're just saying, do you agree with this land code? Yes or no? And the First Nations Land Management Act, people are going to say, oh, no, it's not going to lead to fee simple. But, you know, there's documentation showing that that's the federal objective. Trudeau is going to say that, you know, we're not going to force you to do that. But the way they're forcing you is they're using the dependency and the poverty and saying, if you want more money, you got to go this way. And so that's the coercion, right? It's fiscal coercion, but they don't call it that. You know, they're saying it's, you know, it's a benefit if you go down this path of developing your reserve lands, you know, so that you register all the individual interests. And the history behind this too, you have to keep in mind that originally the Indian Act had in there that if you wanted to use a section of your reserve land for non-native development, you had to surrender that piece of land. And there had to be a community referendum to vote on surrendering that piece of land. Well, in 1998, Manny Jules, who was the chief of the Kamloops Indian Band in British Columbia, next to the city of Kamloops, he wanted to deal with this industrial park on the reserve. And Indian Affairs told him, well, we're not going to amend the Indian Act for you, but if you get 100 bands to agree, band councils, with band council resolutions, we'll amend the Indian Act. So that's what started amending the Indian Act by resolution. Manny organized 100 bands to call for the Indian Act to be amended. So instead of calling it, they amended the Indian Act to remove the section saying about surrendering reserve lands to calling it designated lands. So now that's the term that's in the Indian Act. So when you want to designate a piece of land for non-native development, there has to be a community referendum. And again, they keep reducing the threshold for the voting to 25% of the membership, not 50% plus one. So that's how they're alienating reserve lands, is reducing the voting threshold and allowing band councils to get away with less members. Because a lot of time members won't vote if they don't agree, right? That's the Indian opposition approach. We're just not going to vote, but then it happens anyway, right? The ones who do vote are the ones that make the decision for everybody. So that's the way it works. And I know, and they have a different fiscal policy. There's a self-government fiscal policy. You can look it up. It's on the Government of Canada's website. It's called Collaborative Self-Government Fiscal Policy. And that tells you what the new fiscal relationship is going to be. And that's where they're getting rid of the treaty obligations and the fiduciary obligations that are replacing it with a new funding relationship, which is based on, a funding model and formula based on own source revenue. And for Ottawa, own source revenue is code for taxation. A lot of bands are going into taxation.
Russ, I know you mentioned Manny Jules. Didn't he head up the First Nation Taxation Act? I think he had a part to play in that, correct?
Well, this goes back to the 2004 federal law called the First Nations. They called it the First Nations Fiscal and Statistical Management Act, I think is what it was originally called. Now it's called the First Nations Fiscal Institutions Act, I think. So in 2004, it used to be called the Indian Taxation Advisory Board, but under that law that the Chrétien government passed in 2004, they created 4 institutions, national institutions. They created the First Nations Finance Authority, which is a revolving loan fund for people who join into that to borrow money to build roads and bridges on reserve. They created the First Nations Financial Management Board, which is tied to the First Nations Finance Authority and the revolving loan fund. And they created the First Nations Tax Commission. So they renamed the Taxation Advisory Board into the First Nations Tax Commission. Manny Jules heads that up. And then they created the First Nations Statistical Institute. But when Harper was in power, he stopped funding it, so that institute died. But the other 3 national institutions are alive. And they're all based, well, they're all pretty much based in BC. But I think they're setting up offices in North Bay on the Nipissing Reserve too in Ontario. At least that's where the National Aboriginal Lands Management Association is. So they have a national institution too. So there's fiscal institutions and there's a national lands institution called the Lands Advisory Board to implement that, National Aboriginal Lands Management Association work tied to the Land Management Act. So you have the 3 national fiscal institutions, you have the National Lands Institution, and now they want to create a national infrastructure institution for water and sewer issues. And they want to do that through legislation too. So the federal government's been using these national institutions, which they call First Nations led, but that's, in my opinion, that's false because it was created under federal laws. And the boards of those national institutions are appointed by the federal ministers.